welcome to my channel. My name is Esther and today I'll be sharing with you a sew-along video of the By Hand London Tamzin dress. Before I do, I'll just tell you what I'm wearing. This is my very first jumpsuit and I'll insert a picture. It's a mix of 3 patterns. It's the New Look 6262 bodice with New Look 6446 trousers. I've just picked the trouser piece of this jumpsuit and I added the sleeve from McCall's 7892. So it's a nice mix of patterns and it's my custom garment. So for today's video, in my August makes video, I promised that I was going to do a By Hand London Tamzin dress sew along, and I'm fulfilling my promise. This video is going to be essentially a tutorial of the Tamzin dress. First make was a hack and I hacked it into a top, and now I've done a dress which you'll see my sew along. I've made a size 18 using the D-cup pattern. Also, I've shortened the skirt by 4 inches and I've just used the lengthen and shorten lines to shorten the skirt. And then for my bodice, what I've done is that I've taken in the seams just slightly within the waist seams. So the bodice is the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and as we go down to the waist, I've just taken it a little bit bigger. So the seam allowance just towards the waist for all the pieces is about 2 centimeters. Also, I've shortened the bodice by 2 centimeters as well. So what I did for that was that I just cut it at the very bottom of each of the bodice pieces and by 2 centimeters. So I think that's all the adjustments I made. What I'll say to you is that alter your pattern, cut up your fabric, and you can join us for the sew along. Where it concerns the sleeves as well as the skirt, I would say it's best to alter the length before you start sewing, because there's not much room after you start sewing to really take off the length. It's best to adjust the length of the sleeves as well as the skirt pieces before you start sewing. I don't think you can really do it after you started sewing. You can, but it will be a little bit of work. Make sure that when you cut up your fabric, you create all your markings, because those notches are going to be used to create our pin tucks. They're very important that we have the right notches, and I'll show you the process of creating it throughout the video. I'll also say that the pattern is a loose fitting one, so it's very forgiving regarding fit. If you're in between sizes, my suggestion would be just make the bigger size and then you can make your seam allowance just a little bit bigger. The only adjustments I have made are the ones I said before. I haven't made much adjustments and I absolutely love the fit of this one. I'll quickly share with you how I've made the top. To make the top, instead of trying to alter the skirt pieces, I've actually used the sleeve as my skirt pieces. So what I've done is I just folded the sleeve head so it's a straight line, and I use that to cut my fabric for the top. If you're interested in making the top, you can leave a comment and I can explain it to you better in the comments. It's very easy to make if you wanted to make a top. Also, I just remembered another alteration I've done. For my skirt, instead of using the actual width that the skirt pieces have, I have actually just used the whole width of my fabric. So my skirt piece is actually just the length of the skirt as well as the full width of my fabric. It just means that my skirt has more volume. You don't have to do that, but that's what I've done. So I think that's it. Let's get sewing. You should have your facing pieces, your front facing and the back facing. Both pieces should be interfaced. I have used fusible interfacing. Set them aside for later. Now you have your waist ties. You should have 2 waist ties, and because my fabric looks a bit similar on the right side and the wrong side, I have used masking tape to mark the wrong side of my fabric. Pin your waist ties right sides together. We will be stitching that edge all the way to the angled edge. We stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, making sure to stitch the angled edge, but leave the straight edge unstitched. Trim and grade both seam allowances so that the seam allowance are trimmed at 2 different widths. And for me, my top seam allowance is slightly shorter than my bottom seam allowance. We need to turn the ties to the right sides. I use this prim turning set I just discovered. This is my first try, and this is the largest size. Now press the waist ties as well as baste at the unstitched edge. Take your bodice center front piece and turn it to the right side. We're going to mark 1.5 centimeters from the bottom of our bodice center front. You can mark using a ruler or a seam gauge, but I like to use this paper seam gauge that I have DIY'd. I discovered it from Montoya's YouTube, and I'll link it down below. Using a pin, I've marked the 1.5 centimeter points, and now pin the waist ties to the bodice. Baste the waist ties to the bodice at a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Pin the bodice center front to the bodice side front, matching all the notches. Do this with right sides together. Remember that you are trying to match the stitching lines and not necessarily the raw edges. So it might look weird when you're trying to pin, but don't worry, when you stitch it, it will all come together seamlessly. Pin your bodice center front and your bodice side front together, easing the curve. You should have your waist tie sandwiched in between the center front and the side front, like so. So do the same for both sides of the side front. Take to your sewing machine and sew it at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. The bodice front should look a little bit like this. Now you're going to set it aside. Take your bodice center back piece and with right sides together, pin your side back pieces to your center back pieces. Stitch both side back pieces to the center back piece at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Our back pieces are now stitched together. Finish the seam allowance for the front bodice and the back bodice. You can use an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Press the finished seam allowance towards the sides. So do the same for the front bodice piece as well as the back bodice piece. Put your front bodice piece over your back bodice piece with right sides together, pin, matching the seams at the front with the seams in the back. Remember that we are not trying to match the raw edges, but the stitching line. So when you stitch, everything would match. Stitch the shoulder seams at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Finish the seam allowances and then press them open. Take your front facing piece and with right sides together, pin it to your back facing piece. Stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Finish your seam allowances and press open. The facing pieces are now stitched together. So what you're going to do is you're going to sew a line of basting stitches at a 1/2 inch seam allowance or a 1.2 centimeter seam allowance. We have basted all the way round at the 1.2 centimeter seam allowance. Now we're going to press in that raw edge by a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So when you press this in, on the right side, you should not see any basting stitches. So you're pressing in to the wrong side, and on the right side, there should not be any basting stitches. All my edges are now pressed in by 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and this is how it should look on the right side. This is how it looks on the wrong side. Go ahead and trim the seam allowance, and this is how it should look on the wrong side. Pin the wrong side of the bodice to the right side of the facing. So the right side of the facing should be on top of the wrong side of the bodice. Pin all the way round and sew at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Trim and grade the excess seam allowance, as well as clip the corners of the square and clip the curves at intervals. This will help our facing lay flat when we turn it to the right side. Turn the facing piece to the right side all the way around. So turn it to the right side all the way around, and then you can pin it. And also take the time to press the seam. I like to use glass head pins so I can press my seam even though it's pinned. My facing has been pinned and pressed all the way round. This is the right side of my bodice, and my facing will be top stitched to the right side of my bodice. The facing should lie just beside the seam. Now take it to the machine and top stitch all the way round. This is what the bodice should look like. Pin the front bodice to the back bodice at the sides with right sides together. Sew this at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and finish the side seams on your overlocker or with a zigzag stitch. This is the sleeve piece. Before assembling the sleeves, we will press the top lines. So take the sleeves wrong sides together and press while matching your notches. So match the notch at both sleeve ends, press, and repeat that for the next two notches. You should now have 3 tucks pressed, and the notches at the very bottom are going to be used to create our hem. Go ahead and press those 2 in as well. So you should have 5 tucks pressed, 3 for the pin tucks and 2 for the hem on the bottom. Pin the sleeves at the sides with right sides together and make sure that you match your notches. Sew at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Finish your seams and press them open. Do this for both sleeve pieces. And now this is how your sleeve should look. It's time to create our hem as well as our tucks. So starting at the bottom, fold in the first line and then fold it in again. This is how we will create our hem. You can pin it all the way round. To create the pin tuck, we're going to fold in the lines that have already been pressed. They have to be wrong sides together. Since you've pressed those lines before, it's going to be very easy to find the lines. And even if they don't perfectly match, you can still repress. So fold in those lines with the wrong sides together. What we need to do here is to mark a 1-inch seam allowance. Alternatively, if your sewing machine has a 25 centimeter line, you can just use that without pinning. So go all the way round and just pin your 1-inch mark. And at this 1-inch mark is where we're going to stitch. So do that for the first pin tuck. Do the same step for the second pin tuck. You can decide to sew them one after the other, or you can pin the way I'm doing now and just sew it all together at the same time. It's left to you. I prefer this just because it's faster. So take this to your machine and sew the 4 lines. The pin tuck and then the hem. Your sleeves should look like this. You should have 3 pin tucks and then your hem. I've gone ahead to create my gathering stitches using 2 rows of basting stitches done at a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So your gathering stitches should be between the 2 notches at the far end. So you have 3 notches on your sleeve head. 1 is at the center and there are 2 at the sides. So the gathering stitches should be in between the 2 at the sides. Do it for both sleeves and then we gather. You want the sleeve to match the armhole opening of the bodice. So just keep gathering. Keep gathering. This is what our sleeves should look like, and make sure your sleeves are on the right side. Turn your bodice to the wrong side. Insert your arm into your sleeve. And now put it through your bodice. The right side of your sleeve will be together with the right side of your bodice. What you want to do now is to match the notches. The notches on the sides of your sleeves match the notches on the sides of your bodices. You need to do this for both sleeves. Take it to your sewing machine and then stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Go ahead and finish the seam allowance of your shoulder seam. This is what our bodice is looking like. Make sure to press your seam allowance away from your bodice. Press it away from the bodice. You're halfway through sewing your dress, and this is a good place to try on your bodice for feet and admire your handwork. This is my skirt piece, which is very massive. We have similar notches to that of the sleeves. This is the right side and this is the wrong side. To create our hem and our pin tucks, similar to the sleeves, we're going to press it with wrong sides together. We start at the bottom notch for the hem, and then the second notch as well, we turn it in twice to create the hem. Then you go press the pin tucks, one, the second one, and the third one. The only difference in the tucks for the skirt piece is that these tucks are stitched at a 1.5-inch seam allowance. Go ahead and create the tucks on the sewing machine, and then we're going to gather our skirt piece. The top of the skirt is going to be gathered to fit into our bodice piece, and I have used dental floss to gather mine because it's such a large piece that it's easier for me using dental floss. To gather with dental floss, you put your dental floss on your fabric and use a zigzag stitch over the dental floss. Place your skirt and your bodice together with right sides facing. Pin it, matching the side seams of the bodice to the side seams of the skirt. Take this to the sewing machine, stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and don't forget to finish your seams. We're very close to the end because our hem has been finished. So this is our final stitch. So don't forget to give it a final press, and you're done.